The Pulsar Time Computer was famously the first commercially available electronic digital watch in 1972. Sadly, this brand both marks the starting gun for the initial huge boom of investment into digital watches, as well as the signal of the downslide of that same industry in the US, as Seiko acquired the Pulsar brand in 1979 from Rhapsody, a Philadelphia jewelry supply company, who had itself acquired it from the owners of HMW Industries in 1977, who'd already sold the Hamilton brand to the Swiss holding company SSIH in 1974, so that they could focus on the Time Computer Inc. brand. By 1979, a lot of the Western brands and module manufacturers had already fallen due to a failure to be able to compete, and those that were still in the game were often giving them away as promotional items for other products, hardly the prestige that they'd been held in a few years earlier. I've told the stories of Casio and Timex who managed to stay alive in the 80s through the foray into sports-based watches, like the G-Shock and Ironman Triathlon, as well as Seiko's continued push to maintain value, with serious innovation like the TV watch and wrist computers. But less well known to most, even when they may be familiar with the brand names in a distant way, is Seiko's other horses in the game. Their more affordable brands of the revived Pulsar, its Japanese flavoured equivalent Alba, and the budget playground of Lorus, which is the story that we look to tell in this video. This is a story of where Seiko's commitment to innovation in technology was diffused into some funkier forms, but they had some space to experiment, and I think you'll find there's lots of fun stuff in there that you won't have seen elsewhere. Under Seiko, the story of the twin brands of Pulsar, focused on Western markets, and Alba, meaning dawn, focused on Japan, starts in 1979, with them both launching, or relaunching in the case of Pulsar, in the same year. The initial offerings of Pulsar weren't particularly groundbreaking, and were essentially affordable versions of Seiko's main brand watches. They also very much maintained the branding of the original Pulsar, seemingly trying to inherit some of the legacy of that brand, which I'm not sure ever really landed and faded out later, although still occasionally pops up. Pulsar's first digital under Seiko, I think, was the Y709, which isn't too distinctive from the standard fare of the time. These more basic models would continue into the early 80s, with Pulsar watches including the Y729, 770, 665, 759, and 789, which I actually own a version of, and forgive the dodgy strap. With Alba, I believe the first watch was the Y448, some great research by Coolest Vintage here, and Alba had a portfolio of watches that looked similar for the Japan market, although the colourful advertising already gives a feel for the difference in tone. However, it wasn't too long before both brands got their own cool watch that was distinct from the normal Seiko options, and this was the Y739 calculator watch. Now this is very appropriate as the Pulsar Time Computer team had developed one of the original calculator watches. Citizen grabbed the LCD title, and Seiko did have its own lovely options, so the Y739 was Seiko's answer under its own more affordable brands. Unlike the finger-amenable Casio, it came with a stylus to push the numbers, and is a bit of a cult classic for those in the know. Another area that Seiko was an innovator was 1979's H127 and 1981's H239, along with the likes of Citizen and the 8900 Digi Ana, and this was the Ana-Digi space. The brand they came up with for their Pulsar range was the Y651 Dimension II in 1981, which they plugged a decent amount across the US, with Alba also having a version that you can see on screen now. The slightly more bland Y652 would follow that and came in a few packages, and you would see some other Ana-Digis over time that don't really make the cut for a deeper dive in this video, like the Y960. But don't worry, Pulsar still had cool new tech up its sleeve. Seiko used the double layer LCDs for the iconic world map A239, but I believe the combination with the analog and digital data read was a Pulsar first, combining a back LCD layer with an analog. Branded The Wizard, they would launch this in Y951 and Y950 around 1982 or 83, and this was available as well under the Alba brand. This enabled a very innocuous watch with a press of a button to display a world map and turn into a super cool watch. It wasn't until 1995 where Casio got on a similar bandwagon with the twin SEP technology, so this really is a nice little piece of history. As I mentioned in the intro, the early 80s saw Casio and Timex differentiate from more commoditized options of the digital watch market with sportier brands, and the link to water resistance with the 1983 G-Shock Square and 1984 Triathlon, and later Ironman Triathlon and Atlantis models. This would carry over to the Pulsar and Alba brands with the 82 or 83 Y771 with dot matrix running man. On a non-sporty note, Pulsar and its Seiko parent brand were the first with a dot matrix model on display with the D03 Y651. Another sporty looking option was the Y716, available in both Pulsar and Alba variations, and this Alba dual time I think is a pretty classy looking option. The other aspect of Casio's success in the 1980s was their switch over to being a bit more plastic fantastic with the F100. The Alba Y797 shows one of their standard looking watches in plastic. These more affordable basic plastic watches were clearly an influence for Seiko in 1982 launching the Lorus brand, which were very basic looking sporty styled watches. Here is an advert for Lorus Sports popping up in 1982 that is typical of the basic style you would see for many years in Argos catalogues here in the UK, as well as this more funky analog quartz I couldn't help but throw in. Another favourite find for me in prepping this video is that there is a Lorus version of one of my absolute favourite watches, the Seiko A829 Rotocall range, so marketed due to the function being changed by rotating the bezel. Fans call the Seiko version the Astronaut as it's a watch that's regularly been worn in the International Space Station by many an astronaut, as well as to the depths, with one of my favourite digital watch anecdotes being about the world's most vertical watch from this range worn by Kathy Sullivan in space and in Challenger Deep. Now, unlike rivals Casio, Seiko never quite allowed themselves to go full novelty under their main brand with gaming watches, outside the inclusion of ROM packs on their wrist computer. This domain was left for Nelsonic to pounce in and own, as I've covered elsewhere. However, within the Alba and Pulsar range, they did play around with gaming watches with the Y760 and Y827 game gun and slot machine watches, with other game watches including the interesting Y765, Dragon Lady, Y666 and Y700. This Y757 Mickey Mouse tennis watch was interesting, and there was the curious 1982 or 83 Y822 voice and game baseball watch. A plainer version of this was the Y823 voice alarm watch. There was also a brief flirtation with the biorhythms fad with the Y772, and like many other brands like Armatron and countless others, the Lorus brand in 1983 released their own radio watch, the W601, that was very widely publicised and one that you probably came across if you were around at the time. Things were a bit quieter in the mid-80s period, and outside of Casio successes, this is often seen as the period where digital watches are out of fashion for a time, but one high point was 1985's thin W192 solar digital watch that claimed to be the world's first batteryless solar digital LCD watch. I hadn't realised that this was a world's first for Lorus, so do let me know in the comments if you know either way, but it makes sense as I think the Casio batteryless AL180 was launched in 1986. The thinness of the presentation also predates the look of the 1988 Sanyo Morton and Citizen DX80, which leveraged the thinning out of solar panel technology that both those brands were pioneers in with the Immortan and Eco Drive respectively. Sadly, I'm providing a slightly biased view of the state of the industry at the time. Brands like Lorus were quite literally being marketed as disposable watches, apparently as a positive thing, and a theme of my research of newspapers of the time was stores falling over themselves to give these things away, as typified by this co-promote with Konica that seemed to be running the whole year. There was also a period of Disney licensed watches, where a Lorus Digital was amongst the options, and this weird phase.
Playboy Quartz watches, another excellent product from Alba.
But digital watches would come back into fashion for a period in the early 1990s, coalescing in the US around the introduction of Indiglow's electroluminescent backlight technology to the Iron Man Triathlon range, with this hitting the peak of the mainstream on the wrist of the president of the time, with Al Gore rocking a Casio databank, and the Datalink being a favourite in space. The era of speed would begin in the early 90s with the crazy 1 in 1,000 second chronographs, digital tachymeters and graphical displays, as well as the era of G-Shocks on steroids with the beginning of the Master of G range with 1993's Frogman. All these different background ingredients would find their way into the Pulsar, Alba and Lorus ranges. For example, 1991's Lorus Marine Tech with 30 lap memory and 200 meter water resistance, what a cool watch. The Racing Pro with a similar vibe and track tech with the 1 in 1,000 second chrono. The Alba W348 had quite a few different presentations with the 1 in 1,000 second chrono, with the 349 prominently displaying this capability across both the Alba and Lorus range. We see the initial Hypertech range that we'll come back to with the V081 with 100 lap memory, the V083 and V084 I've seen called the Epsilon, and V085 with panel light, their version of Indiglow, Foxfire or Illuminator, after which my channel is inspired if you didn't know. Other obscure ones were the Trailmaster, their answer to ProTrek style offerings, and another sporty option that looked very 90s includes this USA Olympics linked watch. The W357 Tomahawk was a punchy yellow colour with graphical display and 30 lap memory. The W358 Navigator race circuit timer had had a 100 lap memory, which Pulsar utilised in a totally different looking case. The W359 hot gear was very cool, and the W801 with large display and differently coloured buttons was available. The W802 trail bike tacky data memo was a combination I never knew I needed, and the W325 exercise walking watch is Alba's answer to the Casio jog and walk calorie and beeps a rhythm that sets your pace. The W329 is multi-sport oriented, and check out the totally over-the-top design of these models. I believe W339, but I do get confused as these totally different watches I think also have that reference, including this Thrasher model. If you want out-and-out beast mode Timex Humvee style, check out this Alba UKG Gory W810 or Gorilla in its base form and in this particular funky model. The W680 Super Dimension, sometimes branded Vortex, is a great find, and I didn't know it used the rotating bezel, using the same module as the Giugiaro designed and Ayrton Senna favourite, the Speedmaster LCD, featured in my recent Racing Digitals video. And finally in this group of chunkier sport models, we have the W820 Hypertech panel light with massive EL backlit screen, but it's Hypertech as a sensor-based sub-brand where things get really cool. The other aspect that really came on in the 90s, although its beginnings were the 1982 Citizen Ana-Digi Temp, was sensor-based watches, especially the combination of these in things like 1992's twin sensor ALT 6000, with the third sensor ingredient enabling compass watches with the 1990 CPW 100 and 200, which would enable Casio's triple sensor-based ProTrek brand. Seiko was in on the game with 1992's W730 Alti Memory, and this was repackaged under the Alba brand under a much funkier purple colour. Lorus was actually out at the same time as Casio's CPW 100 with the launch of Lorus Sports Vector. Here is a fun ad from the time with a not so subtle dig at their competitors, so they're clearly proud of this one.
And now the Lorus Vector, a digital compass built into a precision chronograph. So forget
The new Breath Spray 9000. Quartz accuracy never tasted this good.
Stick with Lorus, the only time worth keeping.
This would be made available under the Alba hot gear range in crazy colours with the W800, but the most fun from this period was the Hypertech range that deployed sensors. Based on the more plain looking Seiko Scuba Master M796 released in 1990, check out this W760, which also came in a typical Alba crazy colourway, and there was this more elaborately shaped model. Amongst this positively transformer-esque range, we have the 1995 W750 altimeter barometer and temperature. I like the little sun and umbrella on the barometer. The W751 field gear altimeter barometer, their answer to Casio's weather station, the W753 Alti Chrono field gear, and whilst I'm here, I can't help but throw in this crazy looking analog field gear with signal mirror. The W754 altimeter barometer in super chunky case, I think is the archetypal example of this range. And there was this W700 thermo memory, with the W701 being a particularly funky version, also branded as Trailmaster, and this W780. Let me know which one is your favourite within the comments, as I know I've got some Hypertech fans that have been asking me to cover them in a video. There'd been a surfing-themed digital niche carved out by the Freestyle Shark brand going back to the 80s. In the 1990s, we would start to see the rise of the more action-oriented form of sports, growing out of surf-style culture, with skateboarding and snowboarding culture really emerging into the mainstream in the 90s with a harder edge to it. This would be personified in ESPN's Extreme Games in 1995, later X Games in 1996. The Nixon brand is another product of this era, with the Tony Hawk narrated Dork Watch. A brand that seized on this zeitgeist was Alba in Japan with 1995's Spoon range, which would launch later in the US and be linked to the Pulsar brand. According to this article from the time, apparently Jack Nicholson was a wearer, as well as the Hanson band. There were many variations on this basic W620, including these ingot models, which were also used by other Alba youth watches like this AKA reference. The W626 had a narrower display, the W650 leveraged the Disney collaboration with this Mickey Mouse version, and when I see the W671, it makes me think,
I likes armadillos! Smooth on the inside, crunchy on the outside. Armadillos!
Dime, the surprising alternative to armadillos.
Venturing further into the depths of obscure spoon models, we have this W852 Cornelius model, which I believe had a scattered screen linked to the Millennium Bug, and Stefano Giovannoni designed the W804 Octopussy and W803 Volcano models. The 2000 W850 Teardrop model included a collaboration with Yoshitaka Amano, an anime character designer whose credits included significant contributions to the Final Fantasy series. The W854 includes this Rob Mercado model, who's an Australian surfer, and staying on the surf theme, time, this is the Surfmaster model. They would link some other interesting watches to the Spoon brand, including the W441 Secret Agent or SAM model, Web in the UK, which included 45 pre-programmed proverbs that would scroll past every 10 minutes, with the 440 having a similar look. The W442 Spoon Hal or Float was a more rounded version, and another bonkers model themed after the famous sumo wrestler that fought Muhammad Ali was the Inoki X, a crazy watch that would probably fit around my neck. The Spoon sub-brand was typical of what I think of as the Tokyo Flash era of the 2000s, which started out as a seller of these more random Alba and Citizen independent watches. Some other Alba youth models include the W621 under the AKA brand, which stands for Active, Keen and Aggressive, the W670 aka Space, the W853, which is very Seiko H Timetronic, the Cyber Trance range, and Street Gear range. Also in the 2000s you would see the Vividigi branding. This was described as a newly developed liquid crystal panel that had various colour combinations of segments and backgrounds and lights up in various manners, providing wide varieties of displays. This was seen in the W30 and Alba Track Tech W151. From 1999 there was a fun Lorus brand called Fusion that saw some curious all-metal looking options. The one on the poster is the cool shaped W160. This brand is described as being where modernity meets machine, where style combines with substance, and where design fuses with daring. Examples include the Y737 and Y717, an angular looking 120 and W100. Here is Russell's lovely condition one, and Sam Zarafa has a really nice collection I had to include. The Fusion brand has even lived on a bit under the ladies line with these examples on screen. I really like this Alba ZIK from 2002, and other obscure ones I found was this Alba Signa W861, the ultra modern looking W860, and the W863 that links into Pulsar's rally sponsorship. Another sub-brand originating in 2000 was the Pulsar or Alba Wired. Wired was all about Tokyo life and Tokyo time, with the core concept being from Japan to the world. The first collection was the Font DQ and Full Dot models. It's a variant of the Full Dot model that was worn by Ben Affleck in 2003's Paycheck, with early collaborations including shopping site 7 Dream, and also Beams the following year, which would have multiple collections. In 2002 there was a World Cup edition, and the Crown operated Font DQ would follow in 2002, with the W720 being a slightly more rounded version, with these being some of the other early 2000s examples. Moving further into the 2000s there were limited editions, such as this 2007 Honey collaboration, these 2009 Crooks and Castles and Undercover Streetwear collaborations, the 2010 colourful QT range, and it's a brand that was leveraged for the fantastic 2015 homage to the original G757 Seiko Bond watch, which was featured in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, which was a continuation of a previous analog-based collaboration with the same franchise. Pulsar, Alba, and indeed the Wired brand are still available today. Pulsar make a few digitals that I've shown on screen, but only Lorus make classic digitals at any scale, and here is a selection of some of them. Not very inspiring when you compare to the likes of Casio, but my hope from the video is that I've shed some light onto a few gems that they do have in the back catalogue. I hope you've enjoyed, and if you did, I reckon you'll like my deeper dive into the parent brand Seiko's digital watch catalogue, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.